Afternoon.
Welcome to this week's episode of Purely OCD, where
Hmm.
wow,
Redo.
take two. Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's episode of Purely OCD, where we will be talking about sexual orientation OCD and recovery.
Yeah.
And welcome to 2024 as well, which I'm still pretty sure sounds like, like a made up time in the future. But
Yeah.
that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. It's wild.
Yeah. So where shall we begin?
Well, and here exposure and response prevention is super helpful here.
Have you heard that? That's good.
Yeah, I've got wind of it. Now, whether somebody wants to engage in it is a whole nother deal.
That's true. That is true. So yeah, obviously we talk about this all the time, but while we're at it, let's just talk about what is exposure and response prevention?
So, exposure is bringing up the feared thought or feeling or sensation that's associated with the trigger. And then we are choosing not to engage in compulsive behavior like we normally would to try to get rid of that. So we're really dropping into the fear and the feeling of the fear and doing nothing about it.
Amen. Well said. And straight to the point. So, within the realm of sexual orientation OCD, we are trying to purposefully trigger thoughts that of uncertainty about one's sexual orientation,
Yes.
which you can, if you didn't know what it was before, and when Kelley made that joke that, like, it's whether or not somebody wants to engage in the process, that's why, right? Like, it is very uncomfortable by design to face down the triggers that bring up these thoughts and the feelings of anxiety that come along with them.
Right.
So, uh,
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's worthwhile to, before we launch into like the specifics of how we would see this manifesting with sexual orientation OCD, just to give a brief nod as to why we do exposure and response prevention. I think it's really important because obviously, like you said, a lot of people won't if they don't understand the rationale behind it.
Yeah. Well, the whole crux of why OCD is a disorder is because it's negative. The compulsions are negatively reinforcing that initial fear. So the more we do that, the more this fear grows exponentially. And slowly our world becomes smaller and smaller. So where one day maybe we're watching, a Ted Bundy serial killer movie and we're like, oh, what if I'm a serial killer? So I'm going to stop watching all of those. But because we've now told our brain, oh, avoid that because that thing's scary. And when you don't do that, you don't feel anxious. That's great. So every time you feel anxious, specifically associated with that fear, we're going to do everything in our power to neutralize it and run from it. So that might then now look like, instead of watching documentaries on that, it might be mentally reviewing back when you had aggressive urges or feelings towards somebody, and did I actually feel like I wanted to act on that, and ruminate on that, and then say, you know what, maybe that person triggers me, so I'm going to avoid that person, or I'm going to
Mm.
avoid people altogether. So the reason, in fact, is that we want to live our life with the fear, with the uncertainty, without it just like controlling every single thing we do. I don't know
Well
if that
said.
answers the question, but
No, I think it does. I think that the crux of the reason why we do ERP is because without it, without being willing to experience the triggers, and this is what you're saying, our lives become small, like
yeah.
very small. And so it seems like that's the solution, right? I'm going to avoid all of these things, or I'm going to spend a ton of time trying to resolve the uncertainty that I'm experiencing around this question. In this case, what is my authentic sexual orientation? Um, but yeah, it's not the solution. It actually, as we've said many times on here, is the problem, and it's the problem because it makes your life so small.
Right.
And it not only are you going to avoid things, but then like ruminating takes you out of the here and now, so you can actually be at an event and really not be present for any of it. Be like, oh, I really wasn't. And like, nobody's present 100% of the time, but
Yeah.
one would hope that you'd be present more than what is allowed if you're really dug deep in the back of your brain trying to figure out what a physical sensation means. So learning how to be in the presence of those triggers without doing anything gives you more freedom to be more present, to connect in ways that are meaningful to you. And yeah, just to show up to the event in some instances, or to, yeah. So I'm just reiterating everything that you just said.
No, but I
But
think you did say the presence of the fear being there is such a good point, because when people say like, oh, you went to an event and you weren't present, they're thinking, oh, well, the present moment is a positive experience, but the present moment includes the fears as well. It's
mm,
just we're choosing to not engage further and make things more complex and difficult. Like the present moment includes that your brain's going to get pulled away with the intrusive thought, and that you're
mm,
redirecting and refocusing on what's happening instead of drifting. So I like that you
yeah.
brought it up in that way.
Well, and that reminds me of a book that I picked up because you were reading it at one point, which is
Okay.
No Mud, No Lotus by Thich Nhat
Yes.
Hanh, and this idea of holding well, he talks about this experience, although it's certainly not just him that talks about it,
Right.
or talked about it. Um, but I think that this idea of like being you have to be able to accept that anxiety is a part of the experience in order to have the experience,
Yeah.
because otherwise you're going to so aggressively start to chase down and try to fix the anxiety that you miss out on the experience entirely.
Yeah.
um, and he doesn't say it in those terms. He's like,
No.
happiness is possible right here, but happiness cannot be without sadness. It's like,
Yeah.
good point, Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah.
Good point.
Very good point.
So obviously we've talked a lot thus far in this series about, what is an obsession, what's a compulsion, and essentially, as we've been discussing, the framework is let's bring about the obsession so you can practice refraining from the compulsion, so you can get better at being in the presence of the obsession, the anxiety, without getting totally derailed. Um,
Yeah. Have we lost you yet? Like that's super scary, because the compulsions are serving like we're asking you to do the complete opposite.
yep, yep. And it's so, so important to learn how to be in the presence of discomfort. On like can I go on a brief tangent? I
Of course.
realize that we haven't talked at all about particular exposures
No,
yet,
that's
but
good. Yeah.
um, it's like I watch my daughter, who's now 5 months old, and she's doing tummy time, which if you have children, you know this. If you don't, let me share. Every child I've ever met hates tummy time, at least at first.
Yeah.
Because why? Because it's hard.
It's
Right? Like,
uncomfortable. They have to lift their heavy heads with their tiny necks.
yeah, and they got no neck muscles thus
None.
far. Um, and I've learned also that the center of gravity apparently is like up here at first. So it's like it's really hard. Like,
Oh.
you're asking them to do something that is really difficult for them.
And they fuss and they
And yeah, and they cry, and you would think like, oh well, when they cry you have to pull them out of it, right? Because that they shouldn't be uncomfortable. Wrong. And
yeah.
that's, as much as like I don't like to see her uncomfortable, and I personally, like, if I could change even my own experience of discomfort without it impacting my life negatively, I probably would in a lot of instances,
Oh my God.
right? But in this,
Clearly we tried. Otherwise we
we
wouldn't
did,
be.
we tried so hard, did not work. um
Ended up in a lot of therapy and then became therapists. So weird, like how
That's
that works out.
yeah, we promise. And like, you go ahead and try if you need to prove it to
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
like, we really gave it the good old college try, so to speak. But if you look at that instance, right, if you look at her with this tummy time nonsense, that if she's not willing to be frustrated, she never gets to learn how to lift her head, which obviously is something is really important for her to
Super
live her
important.
life,
Yeah.
you know? And so helping her to practice feeling that level of discomfort so that she can live life and you know, be the kind of person that can hold her head up, literally, is important. And that's the same, it's essentially the same thing we're talking about here.
Yeah. You're relearning your experience with anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we make ourselves anxious? If I have sexual orientation OCD and I am worried that I might, we'll use me as an example because, you know, it's just the two of us talking and I happen to be straight. So, or identify as straight. Like if I have anxiety thoughts, like what if I'm secretly bi, or, you know, what if I'm secretly gay and I'm just identifying with the inauthentic orientation, what kind of exposures might I do?
Well, it's very broad. So just want to remind everyone that just because we're talking about certain exposures doesn't mean they're right for you, and that you want to consult with your own therapist who specializes in OCD, that this is appropriate for your recovery. But
1000%. Thank you. That's a great
yeah.
reminder because obviously this is not therapy.
Yeah.
But
But that being said, it's important to consider what the compulsions the person's engaging in as well, because with this particular set or type, the obsession varies. But if it is like, okay, I'm concerned that maybe secretly I'm bisexual, and as a general rule, it would be, okay, maybe we start by writing the words, right? Like, oh, yes, maybe I am. I'll never find out. So
Yep.
leaving that for uncertainty. It might be not avoiding things that you typically would, like maybe going to a gay pride parade, going there, buying a rainbow sticker, and watching shows that trigger you. It
Yep.
could be, there's just, it's
No,
unlimited.
it is unlimited, and ultimately, you know, it's based on what you want to do with your therapist is to break down what's most triggering to you, because something that's triggering to one person might not be triggering to you and vice
Mhm.
versa. But those are some great ideas, is like even the word, if you like, let's focus in on like maybe I'm secretly bisexual, I'm just not being honest with myself. um, that the word bisexual, to your point, might be very triggering. And if you read it, or, you know, if you find yourself, I don't know what context you might have to write it, but like writing it might be triggering for you. So just practicing that and over
Mhm.
and over and over again, is a good starting point. And then there's this evolution, right, toward things that like, and that's, we don't necessarily have to go in some sort of rigid hierarchy where it's like the least anxiety provoking all the way up to the most anxiety provoking, like perhaps we have, or our field has historically, because we know now with you know, the element of inhibitory learning, that surprise actually supports learning, and learning is obviously a very important part of this process, as we've been talking about. So, but that being said, generally we progress somewhat gradually, just because that helps. It's like learning how to ride a bike or swim in a pool. You're not generally going to throw somebody into the deep end. It doesn't give you a lot of opportunity to practice all of the fundamentals that you
Right.
need.
Or like, oh, do I really want to ever go back to see that therapist ever again? Because they terrified the shit out of me for an
Right?
hour. Yeah.
Right? Can you
Like,
imagine if you went to your first, I guess that there are some children who go to swim classes who are just like thrown in, literally, like that's a thing, I think. But
is it? Yeah. I don't
I
know.
think
I think
maybe,
babies. Yeah. I think they do it with
yeah,
babies
because they already have
because
that.
they already know how to kind of,
But can you
because
imagine
they
like
don't have fear, is why.
Well, and because they already know how to swim because they've been hanging around in liquid for a while.
Yeah.
But imagine like never having swum a day in your life and just being taken
You would
to
probably become way more fearful, right? Like if someone threw me in a bucket of spiders, I would just thinking about it, I just gives
yeah.
me, like I would run for my life.
Where's this bucket of
Versus like,
spiders, by the
let's
way?
let remember Fear Factor? That's what it reminds me of. Okay.
That's true. Okay,
Well,
okay,
like
I get that.
versus let's look at the spider on a printed image and
Yeah,
then let's write the word spider and then let's look at videos of spiders crawling on people, right? Like
yep.
I think I'd rather go with that option.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And in that, you might happen across a spider because that's what life is. And like,
Surprise.
surprise. So like you find that perhaps somebody who like if you again have this specific fear that maybe you're secretly bisexual, you might have somebody in your family come out as bisexual, right? And
Mhm.
like either and that you're close with. And that's going to trigger you. It's going to make you want to figure out what your sexual orientation is, OCD, or what your sexual orientation is with absolute certainty. But that's okay. That those moments are going to be peppered throughout your experience. Those sort of incidental exposures
Yeah, the
are going to
triggers.
happen. Yeah. Yep. It's going to be harder to practice response prevention in those instances, especially if you haven't gone very far in sort of manufactured exposure work where you're
Yeah.
consistently facing it. Because again, you have all of these. We look at the element of swimming, right? Like you have all of these things that you have to keep in mind. Like if I'm just learning how to swim, I mean, I'm making this up because I do know how to swim,
Yeah,
but I have
then you
imagined.
kick your legs first, I think,
Sure. Okay. So you have to kick your legs and
because
then
you
you
have to
have to.
tread water.
Right. And then you somehow have to figure out how to hold your breath. And then you've got to like move your arms and they have to be coordinated with the leg movements. And, like all of these pieces, at first, it's going to be really challenging because you haven't done it before. And that's the same thing here. It's like, okay, I have to accept that I'm having a thought and I have to accept that I'm having a feeling, which sounds pretty low maintenance. But the reality is that if you're used to fighting those things and you're like, okay, there's a thought, I'm going to identify a thought, even that can be very challenging.
Yes, it's such a good point. Like, it's clunky, and it feels clunky almost, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
am I doing like, I don't know if I'm doing it right. It's like, well, you're doing it good enough right now. Like, you're learning how to, recognize that you're having a thought, like you said.
Yeah.
And now I'm noticing I'm having a feeling in my body
Yep.
associated with that thought or trigger.
Yes.
And
Yep.
now I'm recognizing, oh, look, my mind wants to do this whole narrative around it.
Right. Right.
And now I feel compelled to physically not do something or just mentally, right? It could
Yes.
be physically avoiding, but it could also be mentally doing things like, oh, let me have the right thought when I'm thinking about this one person who's bisexual,
Right.
or
Right.
let me remember, like I'm watching a show, maybe a triggering clip with my therapist in session that's 10 seconds long, but the whole time I'm mentally compulsing. And initially, you don't really recognize what that looks like.
Yes.
So it's the exposure, it's bringing on the trigger paired with not compulsing, whether it's
Right.
mental or physical.
Right. But I love how you pieced, like, you sort of parsed the different elements there that you have to be aware of. And frankly, just understanding that you're engaging in a mental activity, just
Yes.
appreciating, like, okay, I'm having a feeling and that feeling lives in my body versus I feel like
Yeah.
this is the end of the world, which is not a feeling at all, but a
Yeah.
thought and is going to lead you to ruminate, right? Like if you're not aware of what's that's actually where I start in therapy. I'm sure
Yeah.
there are some people who are like, what? But I'm like, well,
No,
what do
it's
you think
good.
a thought is? Like what's a thought? And people are often surprised by the fact that it's like, I don't know. I've not really
Yeah.
thought about what a thought is. But if you don't understand what those component parts are, how in the world are you supposed to be able to acknowledge them and then practice disengaging from
Yeah.
them? Or
Separating.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
It doesn't go like happy, angry, frustrated. Feeling real is not on the emotion scale.
It's not.
That's
No.
actually fear.
Yeah, it's a fear related to the thought that I might not be real,
Right.
or,
Right.
an experience of dissociation, right? As
Mhm.
we've talked about. So, in terms of what exposure and response prevention is, because I think oftentimes people want a list. It's like,
Yeah.
these are the things that you do to trigger yourself. You already have that list, probably.
Yeah.
You probably know what would trigger you if you really sat down and thought about it.
Yeah.
It's about learning how to do the things that trigger you, learning how to refrain from responding in any sort of way, and practicing just accepting the presence of the feelings while you're doing all of that. That doesn't mean like you have to stare at the feelings, but just like, oh, okay, there's anxiety. Okay. And
Right.
I'm going to keep reading the newspaper or having this conversation with my friend, or I'm going to go out to the party that I have RSVP'd to, whatever. Like, continue living your life. That's really what response prevention is all about, is just to continue living your life on your terms.
Yeah. And I was just going to add to that, like there might, for exposures, there can also be like this double layer or sometimes even a triple layer where you're maybe watching a show that's triggering you while intentionally bringing up a groinal response, like as an activity, like, oh, look at, I'm aroused while doing this. And then your brain's like, oh, see, what does that mean? And you can say, we don't know.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and I think what you're saying here too is really important, because with when you get triggered, you may engage in a compulsion before you even realize it.
Right.
And so understanding that you can catch yourself at any point and still accept uncertainty, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you check your groin, like let's say you're watching the show, you check your groin, you inadvertently just go like, oh, what do I feel? And then you get that feedback of like, oh, but you feel something, that must mean you're aroused, and you re-trigger yourself and you want to figure out again whether or not you're whatever sexual orientation, that you still have the opportunity to then go, whoa, wait a second, I'm gonna stop digging here. I
Yeah.
don't know what that means. I'm walking away.
Right. Or it could be like, well, I've heard clients say like, well, if I'm intentionally bringing up the groinal response while watching something triggering or talking to somebody that triggers me, won't that then make me bisexual or straight or gay, whatever, wherever the
Yeah.
fear is? It's like, well, that's not how that works, but also we don't know. Like,
Yeah.
pretty sure that's not how sexual orientation works, but
Yeah.
with that in mind, maybe
Yeah.
there's no
Yep.
certainty. Let's find out.
Yeah. Yeah, we
The
gotta
it's really
dive in
more
and
like willingness, right? It's always
mhm,
like, well, versus this outcome. It's like, are they willing to
mhm.
do it?
Yeah. Yeah. Am I willing to be taken off guard? Am I willing to learn something that I don't want to be true, or all of that, or that I
And there
is
might be zero anxiety. Great, but they were so willing to feel it, even like they thought maybe there would be anxiety.
yeah, such a good point.
Yeah.
So, in terms of like the exposures we tend to see, you mentioned that, it looks like watching movies or television shows, or going to places that might be triggering, seeing people that might be triggering. Um,
Reading articles of people who find out or figure out later in life they're identifying differently than they had for 30 years.
yep, yep. And any just I was going to say, any sort of imaginal, whether short form, kind of like what you were talking about earlier, with just phrases, or longer, like not long, but like longer form, like maybe a paragraph stories
Yeah.
about how your worst case scenario comes to pass. Um, but these are all ways in which you can trigger yourself. The best kinds of exposures that I think we can do are those that are really connected to who we want to be as people. So if you have like a loved one who's bisexual and you happen to be afraid that you're, secretly bisexual, that's a great chance to expose
Yeah.
yourself. It's like go hang out with your family member.
Yeah.
That's an exposure, and then refraining from trying to figure out, instead just saying like, I don't know,
That's such a
over
good
and over
point.
again.
That, and also like with this particular type, there could also be more of an impact in their intimate relationships. So there could be like avoidance of sexual encounters or intimacy, and so making that a priority as well.
Yes, that's such a good point. Yes, that's exposure, and yeah, that's an important thing oftentimes in your relationships.
Sometimes it's the hardest of all of the exposures, but yeah.
Legit. Agreed. Well, any other sort of wrap up points on this particular topic?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we got to cover this, and hopefully this has
Yes.
been useful to those who have tuned in. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks on January 29th, I believe, to discuss a new subtype.
Yeah.
Yet TBD.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well,
Good to
have
see you
a
all. See you, and
yes.
I guess
Yeah.
not see our audience, but
Well, we never see our audience,
I
though, in
know.
fairness. Sorry, we just got a comment from David saying, "Hi, just tuning in now. Can I watch this back?" Yes, absolutely. You can watch this on our YouTube channel. We save all of our videos. They're also available on Instagram. They're mostly on my page at this point, which is at The Obsessive Mind. I think I have most of the past episodes on. And we're also on podcast apps.
Yeah.
So
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone has any particular, what's the word that I'm looking for, suggestions for our next topic, you can feel free to email us at purelyocd at gmail.com.
Yes.
Cool.
Okay. Have
All right.
a great week.
Yes. Have a great week.